All right, everybody. Um, so this is going to be a review of Unit 1 key concepts for the 2020 AP Euro test. I reviewed this about 45 minutes ago with 9 or 10 AP Euro students, but I forgot to press record. So I'm going to go through this one more time, maybe a little smoother since it'll be my second go around. But if you were one of those 9 or 10 students and you were hoping to see yourself or something on YouTube or wherever I put this, I apologize for letting you down. Okay, so here we go. Let me bring up what I'm trying to bring up here. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me do this. Okay, so hopefully this works. Oh my, it's going fast. All right, so what I'm going to do, AP Euro concept review, is we are going to go through a little bit of history right before we start with the main concepts of the Renaissance, just to kind of recap where Europe is and why it's there and why things are the way they are. So Roman Empire, 476 falls. This is Roman Empire at its greatest extent. You can see it's gigantic, right? And so when it collapses into a number of different states. And even though I think those are just ethnicities, but anyway, or maybe they're not. Anyway, so when we have all of this sudden uncertainty, we have all these states that are temporary, they're fighting each other constantly. There's inconsistency as far as institutions go. And so, kind of one of those themes we always talked about in class: when times are crazy and chaotic and violent, not a lot gets done, right? I'm not going to school. I'm not doing not all the necessities of life to make a functioning civilization whenever we're constantly at war with each other. And so for around 1,000 years, there's hardly any standardized education outside of the church. There are there's not a lot of laws and institutions that are going to keep people safe from crime. Thus, cities become very dangerous to live in, and they are going to move away and live in small little hamlets and villages for safety reasons, right? To limit the chances that I come across a brigand or a bandit or something. And so as we get into the 1400s, the one unifier, the one consistency in life for the previous 1,000 years or so is going to be the church, is going to be Christianity. And so the church has become more powerful than the state. The church is more important in people's minds than their government is. That bottom bullet there: wars, famine, the Black Plague, they're all things that make people more pious. So we are coming out of, again, centuries of war and famine. We talked about the Black Plague way back in August or September of the beginning of the school year. And those things make people closer to their religion, or at least it makes them more pious, because the afterlife becomes the one thing you can kind of hold on to in the face of all these bad things. All right, feudalism. There we go. So feudalism is the way society is going to be organized for the most of the Middle Ages. And that is going to be that kind of hierarchy of life, right? Like almost a caste system. There. And so the king, of course, is the king who is the king of the entire country, but he does not have the ability, either, lack of money, lack of technology, lack of whatever, for him to effectively govern this whole area. So he has to divvy out those responsibilities to his vassals or his lords, and they are going to govern in his name, essentially, right? And then if those vassals are going to govern their big plot of land, they're going to need people to protect it as well. They're going to hire knights. And those knights, they're going to get plots of land, essentially, and they need people to farm that land and to make that land productive. So they are going to have peasants who live there as their tenants, and those peasants are going to work the land, and in return, they'll pay rent and be protected by the knights, and up and down, right? We have a society based on the people above you, people below you doing their jobs. But if you're the king, you don't like this, because that's all these different people who have real legitimate power, and a lot of power out there that you don't have. All right, so we're going to go through a lot of these units. There are 9 units in AP Euro, according to College Board, and the test on May 13th is going to cover 1 through 7. So each of these will have a 1.1 or 1 point whatever. Later it'll be 2 point whatever. And the first and last key concept of each unit is going to be one, contextualizing, kind of setting up the story, and the last one will be causation, things that result from it, right? So a reminder, especially because you'll be writing an essay where this is one of the points, context is anything that has to do with your subject at hand prior to the time period you're in, right? What is happening before all this that allowed whatever you're about to write about or talk about or learn about to happen? So if you got a essay about the French Revolution down the line, your context would be about absolutism and the Enlightenment and the philosophes or whatever, that kind of sets up why, of all places in Europe, the French Revolution happened in France. All right. So to set up the story here, you have the rediscovery of ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts. And so it's important to remember that the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages is a time period between those two eras of lightness, right? Intellectual lightness, ancient Rome, and then now the Renaissance, and later the Enlightenment and everything. So unlike pretty much any time period since, right? People in the 1400s, your intellectuals of the 1400s, they might actually look at the past, you know, even if it was 1,000+ years ago, and see it as a superior time, right? That they had better morals, they had better intellect, they had more education, they had all these things better way back then than we do right now. So that is kind of a weird thing to wrap your head around, or it can be for me sometimes, but thinking about that aspect of the Renaissance. And like that second from the bottom bullet says, adding new perspectives to education besides just those from the church. The church has been the establishment, has been the one consistent over time. What they say kind of goes, right? And that's why it's always been. But now there are these different mindsets, these different perspectives, even if they are 1,000+ years old, and they're adding to kind of the richness of intellectualism or whatever you want to say. Okay, more context. The Renaissance is going to start in northern Italy, and the reason is because that's where the money's at. That's where these middlemen, these traders and merchants in northern Italy are going to ship things or move things from Africa and Asia to Europe. They're going to bump up the price, and they're going to profit from it. And that's also going to be the creation of the burgher class, or what we call the bourgeoisie, that wealthy upper middle class. And because these guys are actually making money, right? They're becoming very, very wealthy, and they're doing it outside of the king and the queen. And so naturally, as this group becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and more economically important, they're going to start having demands of things, right? They want control on the government. They want control of the economy. From their mindset, they're the best at it. They've been successful in it, and they should have more of a say in it. But back to the Renaissance, with the improvement of art and literature and everything else, that comes out of patronage and leisure time. And so if you have this wealthy middle class who has a lot of money, they can pay for artists to just concentrate on their art, right? If you have a patron and you're a really good artist or a writer or whatever, somebody is going to pay for you to live, right? Pay your room and board, essentially, so you can worry about your art all day long. So you don't have to work a 9 to 5, and then when you get off work, then you have to, write a sonnet or whatever. And so as especially northern Italy becomes more and more wealthy, more people have money, more people are buying things, more people are having nicer homes and nicer lives and higher standards of living, like that bottom bullet says, people are starting to lean into that more economic life, the secular life, rather than just the church, right? Yes, I'm still going to be religious, everyone's going to be religious, but rather than going to church on Sunday, I've got a whole week that I have this money I can do stuff with, right? And I'm going to let that occupy my time some too. All right, Italian Renaissance. So we talked about the first bullet already, bringing back those classic texts and kind of combining them with Christian values. So Christianity was not around, especially with the ancient Greeks and for most of the ancient Romans. And so it's not like I find these old ancient dusty manuscripts and then I forgo my religion or anything, but now I'm going to synthesize those or kind of combine them. So humanism is one of the results of that synthesis. Humanism is that shift where we are worried about how can I improve myself, right? And the example I gave earlier to those 9 or 10 students who are in this Zoom chat was, you are in this, you're taking the time out of your day to study these things to benefit you, not to benefit, me, not to benefit the other kids in your class, not to benefit some kid, 100 miles away or anything. You are doing it for you, and you're trying to improve yourself and trying to improve your future by making these decisions. And that is kind of a humanist idea, that our education should be designed to improve myself. It is not, like it says there on the third bullet, community growth, right? It's about my growth. It's not about how we can all be better humans and benefit every single person in society. Sometimes, in education in life should be a little selfish because it's your life and you need to live it for you. And so when education becomes more about things like reading and writing and arithmetic and science and all those things, there starts to become kind of a separate world there, your secular world and your religious world, right? Yes, it's great to be educated in my religion, in my faith, but on the other hand, I need to learn how to read, write, and do all these other things too. So thinking about this shift that we're starting to go through, where for hundreds of years the church was more important than the state, that's starting to shift back. And if you think to ancient Rome and ancient Greece, they certainly had their religions, but they were secondary and subservient to the state. They were not the powerful entity, okay? And that shift is starting to happen yet again. Art gets better. And if you remember, we went through a lot of art way back when, and it goes from very flat and 2D to a lot more realistic and some just artistically better, I suppose. And so if that is how art is getting, think about how many people are going to use that to improve their prestige. As far as, if I'm someone important, I can commission Da Vinci, I can commission Michelangelo to do a portrait of me, and that's an impressive thing, right? And so churches will do that as well. Get some statues going, make the church look more spectacular. Maybe people want to go more often or take it more seriously. So some names on here, I'll go through these pretty quick. Please don't just use these or use this video as like, okay, I've studied, just because this guy rambled over some slides for a while. So please make sure you're going deeper into these things, have some names know what they did, what they accomplished, who you can associate those subjects with. But really quick, Petrarch, like it says here, father of humanism, he does recover a lot of those manuscripts. One of the first documents we looked at all year was his letter to Livy, which when he writes a letter to Livy, a ancient Roman, and he's going to just kind of talk about how glorious your time must be and how I wish I lived there, and how amoral and dirty and everything else my society is, and how I wish I was born, in the 100s or whenever Livy was around. Machiavelli wrote The Prince, and we talked about that quite a bit, but that is kind of a dummy's guide to being a king or being a ruler. But it's totally about how do I be a good secular ruler, right? It does not take into consideration this idea of being a godly ruler, that one that follows, God's laws, but one that rules and gains power. Okay, so it is kind of separating these two things. Castiglione, the courtier, maybe it's courtier. My pronunciations aren't very good, I don't think. But it is, again, this guide, but it's a guide that's not based on being a good Christian. It's a guide based on being a gentleman, right? And it's a secular ideal of how you behave when you're in front of royalty, or behaving when you're in front of the aristocrats of society. And so again, it's separating these two worlds. We are separating, these two spheres of, yes, I'm religious. Yes, I'm trying to get to heaven. Yes, I'm trying to do these things. But there's another world out there too that's developing independently. Da Vinci and Michelangelo, right? Example of Renaissance men, individuals who are interested and versed in anything, or well-versed, not averse, well-versed in anything. And there's more names besides those, right? Take a look at as many names as you can. You got the time. Northern Renaissance. So the Northern Renaissance, as far as art goes, the art gets better, just like in the Italian Renaissance, but it stays more centered on religious values and religious stories and depictions. So the way I'm kind of looking at Northern Renaissance is it's maybe or just the beginning or the start of the Reformation that'll happen when we talk about Unit 2 in the 1500s. But it's combining those elements of humanism with Christianity, thus getting Christian humanism, which is going to be, like it says in that third bullet, a more human-centered personal relationship with religion rather than letting the church dictate all of my rituals and everything else and my feelings and my opinions. And so if humanism is more about the individual and doing what feels right to me and doing things that benefit me, it would make sense if I carry that mindset over to my religion, and where maybe I should trust my gut, I should trust my feelings and my interpretations of religion and what feels right to me, rather than just following, like it says here, the strict series of laws, rituals, and dogma that the Catholic Church puts out. Okay, so just thinking about those two things being pretty similar, right? It'd be hard to be thinking individually and be thinking for my own good and looking to improve myself, and then go right back to the strict, this is how you be a Christian, and this is how you be a Catholic, that the Roman Catholic Church has on. Okay. Erasmus, right, criticizes the church. We read a little bit, or maybe it's on a test, Julius excluded from heaven, where Julius shows up to heaven, Peter's at the gates, and his evidence for getting let in is he has all these jewels and crown and everything else, and Peter says that's not good enough. And so Erasmus, again, is kind of, in a way, like an early proto-reformer here, in that he is going to criticize the church. He doesn't want to reform it like Luther and guys will later, but he does see some things wrong with the church, and more about, looking inward, having a personal relationship, that kind of early mysticism idea, and not just letting the church tell everybody this is how you do these things. So Thomas More writes Utopia, his idea of a perfect society. And so this is more this idea that a perfect society is one where everybody's equal, right? And maybe it's a precursor to some very, very early socialist ideas or communist ideas or something, but it is a humanist idea of that everybody should be equal. No one should have a coercive force telling them what to do and saying, you've got to work 15, 16-hour days out in the field while I prop my feet up, in my throne or something, right? But just this humanist idea that everybody should have the opportunity anyway to live life for themselves, not to live life for another more powerful individual. 1.4, printing. So, with most of these concepts, especially early on in this class, you can kind of connect back to printing pretty much anytime you want, about how it's important with the spread of it and everything. But anyway, 1450, Gutenberg, obviously more books mean more people are learning how to read. More people learning how to read means people get smarter on average. And if you do have new sources of information, you have new quote unquote authorities, then suddenly there is divergent information out there, right? There's church that contradicts what your government or what your church is saying. Obviously, ideas are going to spread quicker with the printing press than without it, right? You don't have to rely on someone walking with an idea. They can actually print that idea, and it can be disseminated. Of course, obviously, authorities can use the printing press as well. Not only revolutionaries and things have access to a printing press. So they can use it for propaganda. They can use it for to indoctrinate followers or whatever they want to do. And so obviously everyone has access to print. Thus everybody has access to all sorts of information that's out there. Obviously today is no different. All right, 1.5, new monarchies. So we, of course, talked about these things in class, but I never really used the phrase new monarchies. But the new monarchies, like it says on the top bullet, England, Spain, and France are all good examples. These are monarchs looking to centralize power. This is not absolutism, where the king has absolute power. That won't be until the 17th century. We'll get there later with Louis XIV and everything. But this is trying to make the monarch the power in their country, right? Above the nobles, certainly, and also, of course, above the church. So we also, like the third bullet says, it's important to remember, I'm grabbing my coffee here, I'm also on an exercise bike, if you were wondering what kind of weird thing I'm on. Okay. Lack of national identity. That's what I was talking about. So when you have like 1800s nationalism, where every person in every corner of, say, France is going to feel French, it's a lot easier to be the leader of that country, right? Because everyone's already bought in patriotically or identity wise. But if we're still in the 1500s and we still have a very compartmentalized country where people are going to identify with their locality rather than their nationality or the big picture or the big country, you still rely on your nobles in some way, right? Especially if you're, say, France, and people in far northern France and Normandy are going to be quite a bit different than your far people in southern France who are on the border of Spain. Are going to speak different languages and different dialects and everything else. You can't just enforce French law or my French idea from Paris on every single person in France because they're too different. So you do rely on your nobles a little bit, but you certainly want your own country. You don't want the nobles to have any real say here. Okay, so the best way you do that, like it says on the fifth bullet, is you have national armies rather than noble controlled armies. You want every soldier to be loyal to you, and a push came to shove, they would fight for the French crown and not their Norman crown or crown of Brittany or whatever. Okay, bureaucracy is installed, meaning kings are going to find ways to kind of circumvent their nobles as far as collecting taxes and things like that. Like if you go to the DMV and you give money to the person behind the counter and that money goes to the state or the feds or whatever, that person wasn't nominated, that person wasn't elected, they just got hired, they just got appointed. And presumably they're going to do the right thing with your money as far as giving it to whoever it belongs to or is supposed to go to, because they want to keep that job, because they get a paycheck for that. And so if governments can do that, and they're hiring people, like it says here, of the middle class, and we're talking 1500s now. If I hire these people, install them in these pretty important jobs and pay them a decent wage, they're going to, in theory, do that job correctly because they don't want to lose that job. And they're going to be loyal to the state and loyal to that paycheck and not loyal to their noble or that family or that region. And so how can I circumvent the power and influence of nobles? Bureaucracies would be a way to do that. Okay, ways to still collect money, but now it's not in the hands of the nobles or that family or those biased locals or something. Okay, so reducing the power of the church still, right? And some examples, certainly when we get to the Reformation Unit 2, when King Henry VIII forms his own church, he breaks away from the Catholic Church. He does it, of course, he wants a divorce and all that. But another, maybe even bigger reason is if I am the head of my church, now the Catholic Church has no power, no say at all in my country. Thus, I am the most important figure, both in religion and secular political life, and the church is a non-factor, right? How can I accumulate power at the expense of others? Later, the Edict of Nantes, again, this is kind of previewing religious war stuff a little bit, but when King Henry IV grants the edict or signs the Edict of Nantes, gives Calvinists or Huguenots certain rights, certain civil rights in France, there's proof right there he has more power than the church, right? The church would never say, okay, all Huguenots, you can do what you want. The state's going to do that. The state has just told the Catholic Church, you're not the only power in France anymore, okay? Again, going forward, and we're talking Western Europe here, France, Spain, England, Netherlands, all of that, those countries will have monarchies that are the power standing up. That will be the power going forward, right? In the East, it's a little different. You'll have much more feudal life, much more powerful nobles. And remember, the East is always kind of not catching on to these more modern ideas of politics and governing and economics and agriculture and everything else. Okay, 1.6. So switching gears a little bit to Age of Exploration. So some context for the Age of Exploration. The rise of demand in luxury goods from Asia and Africa. You have a difficult time getting those goods from Asia and Africa because you're having to deal with the northern Italian middlemen who are bumping up the price, making those things expensive and limiting what the supply is. And then as far as overland, if you're going to trade directly with Asia, now Constantinople has been captured, been renamed Istanbul, and that's been made difficult as well. And so the goal, the stimulus, is to find that westward path to Asia, right? How can we circumvent these guys, the Ottomans, the Italians, and how can we get a direct connection to all those valuable things in Asia? Then obviously the New World got in the way of that. So it's not like the 1492 came around and all of a sudden the idea to sail west into the Atlantic Ocean popped into people's minds, but the naval technology allows them to do that, right? The caravel, my naval expertise is pretty low, but I think new rudders, better ships, just in general, and you have better compasses and technology and better ways to find direction and be able to repeat trips, right? And not to be slightly off on your calculations and end up 40 miles south or north where you're planning to go, and to be able to return home and things like that. Okay. So when we talk about mercantilism, that fifth or second bullet from the bottom, countries start to shift to mercantilism. A kind of quick and easy definition of mercantilism is to maximize exports to minimize imports, right? Because if you look at running a country like running a business or balancing your own checkbook and everything, at the end of each month, in a perfect world, you are making more money than you're spending. Same thing with exports, or the same thing with running a country. You are looking to, oops, I'll let them in here in a second. I'm almost done. Actually, I'll let them in right now. Okay, I think am I recording here? I believe I am. All right, I'll have to edit this out here. All right, so where was I? Sorry, I had a student pop in. Let's see here. There. All right, we were here, mercantilism, right? Trying to maximize exports, minimize imports. And the best way to do that would be to get colonies, because you can get the raw resources there and then make all these things that you can sell. And so if I'm England and I want to sell tobacco to Europeans, I want to get as many colonies as I can, because I can grow tobacco, send that back to Europe, and make a whole lot of money, right? And that money's going right into my pocket. And so if I'm France, I want to grab those colonies too, because I don't want all the people in France to have to buy English tobacco, right? So obviously there's going to be some conflict there, but that becomes the goal. Let's get colonies to get those resources, and that can make us a more self-sufficient economy. When we talked about this way back when, right, the 3 G's, God, glory, gold. The God part, of course, is the desire to spread Christianity, and then later it becoming a justification for conquest, right? Same thing when we get to imperialism and stuff in the 1800s, that we're doing these things because it'll benefit them as well, even if they are on the surface, right, these cruel, immoral things. All right, 1.7, rivals on the world stage. So we kind of previewed that. European countries naturally come into conflict. Spain and Portugal will be the kind of first competitors, both in Asia and the New World. Remember, Portugal pretty well wins in the East. Spain's going to concentrate on North and South America and the Caribbean and Central America. Treaty of Tordesillas, quick definition, right? When the Pope picks that kind of imaginary line down that meridian, divides the New World between Spain and Portugal. Eventually, France, England, the Netherlands, they're going to get colonies as well. And the big thing here that'll kind of lead into the next one as well is this shifts the power, economic power, and political power eventually in Europe from Italy and the Mediterranean to the Atlantic, because those are the countries who have coasts along the Atlantic Ocean, and they'll be the first ones to colonize, and they'll be the first ones to make all this money. 1.8, Columbian Exchange. So those top 3 bullets are mainly just looking at where each country was primary colonizer for the most part. But eventually this will lead, of course, into slave trade, which is our next topic, 1.9. But thinking about the Columbian Exchange, we'll have plants, animals, and diseases, the impact those diseases have on the natives, the impact those diseases have on eventually when it comes to conquering those natives, and all those things, right? And eventually down the line, things like the potato going to Europe, coming from the New World, will have a major impact as well. 1.9, the slave trade. Understanding the slave trade gets started, the African slave trade, I should say, from the desire for workers on plantation economies, those big giant plots of land. There's not the labor force like there is in Europe with the peasants and the serfs. Thus, they're going to import workers, right? The natives, largely due to getting sick, and being able to run away easier and hide easier because they know where they're from. They're not a sustainable workforce, thus the constant importation of African slaves. 1.10, the commercial revolution. This is the shift from a barter economy, which is the way it's been for a long time, trading goods for other goods or services for services, to a money economy where I give you some kind of money or coinage and you give me my good or service. So this shift means governments are now actively looking to make money and to make profits. So how can we create institutions that will be more efficient? So the Dutch East India Company, colonial companies, those bureaucracies we were talking about a minute ago, those are all examples. Agriculture becomes a commodity or becomes profitable. Farming's gotten better. Farming practices, I should say, have gotten better. And now there's ways to make money. And so, that will result in landlords becoming more strict on who's going to live there and what our rent's going to be and how much you have to produce. Because if I can profit off you, I'm going to try to do that. In Italy, and then I suppose in other countries, where if you make enough money, you can buy titles, you can buy your way into the nobility, which is a pretty new thing. There's some actual social movement now. I mean, it's hard to do, certainly, but it's not the way it's always been. And so in the 800s, if you're a peasant or you're even middle class or whatever, there's just no way you're going to be nobility because you're never going to make enough money, first of all. And then even if you could, you probably couldn't buy your way in anyway. But now when we have this new capitalist money economy, you have people who become very, very wealthy, and they are going to literally buy their way up the social ladder, right? And in the case of, maybe in northern Italy, you have merchant families who eventually rise to pope and things like that because of how much money they make and how powerful they become because of it. Like we talked about with France, right? Nobles of the robe, nobles of the cloth. I think it's the same thing. Where they're literally buying their way in, unlike nobles of the sword. Hopefully I didn't get those two flip-flopped. We have more food, which means populations are, of course, going to grow, and cities will get bigger, and that means we're going to have a larger impoverished urban class, right? So yes, more food is a good thing. You get more people, but that means the food prices will probably go up because more people will grow faster than the amount of food will grow. Thus, you're going to have people who struggle to feed themselves, struggle to live, struggle to survive, and think about how important that class is and what the issues are when it gets too large. Revolutions, right? More. So the major economic changes means the hierarchy is going to get a little different, where you actually have a in-between level. Again, obviously, an in-between, another way to say that would be middle class, and they want some power as well. Right, especially when we're talking about economic things. They're going to probably rightly assume they can make these decisions better than anybody else. Another big theme here, Eastern Europe will resist these changes and be left behind. And so they will still have kind of a feudal system going forward. And they will still rely on these old, archaic ways of agriculture. And that will hurt them eventually. Talked about landlords in Western Europe. How can I profit off my tenants rather than just get the bare minimum of rent? And so this is obviously a little in the future here, but you think about like the Irish potato famine. If I'm a landlord and I can make more money with a guy who's going to farm something besides potatoes, I might do that. And if the potato famine happens to happen, I might take advantage of that. Okay, and then like we just talked about, growth of cities, issues that come with that, new political ideas, socialism, communism, things that happen from the Industrial Revolution, just thinking about how all these things over time connect. The Industrial Revolution probably doesn't happen if cities don't get bigger to begin with, right? We stay a very rural society, like we were pre-Renaissance, then these things don't happen going forward. Last one, Causation in the Renaissance and Age of Discovery. So again, mercantilism going forward, commercialism, capitalism, those become the dominant forces that will kind of govern Western society. You have the new groups, the bourgeoisie, looking to maintain or looking to gain control, looking to gain influence, meaning they want to help lead the country forward, right? That kind of liberal ideas that will pop up post-Enlightenment will be largely led by the bourgeoisie. Monarchs want to increase their power at the expense of the nobility and the church. And like it says here, we are starting a more secular world, although everybody is still extremely, extremely religious. Okay, but now there are these two spheres almost of society coming about, where for a long time it was just the one, where religion dictated every single action I had day to day. Now there's a separate world that maybe religion and those things don't always change the way I behave or the way I act or the decisions I make. All right. So I believe that's, yes, Unit 1. Again, please don't just rely on this video. If you go look at Tom Ritchie or Paul Sargent videos, they go into detail about a lot of these points and spend 6 to 15, 30 minutes on those at times. Need to study as well, but maybe this is kind of jogging your memory. And if some things clicked for you, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. Maybe you don't need to study those as much. But if there's some concepts or some examples we talked about and you didn't have any idea what I was talking about or any memory of that, it's possible that I was just saying crazy things and don't remember that. But I think it's more likely that means you probably need to do some study. All right, guys. Hope to see some of you soon.